Friends, Not Masters. A Political Autobiography. Mohammad Ayub Khan, President of Pakistan. Published in 1967. This is a Plisken audiobook presentation dedicated to those who have worked for the building of Pakistan as a progressive and modern state, and to those who have defended it with such distinction. Chapter 7. Martial Law, Part 1. The revolution had immediate as well as long-term objectives. The immediate objective was to rehabilitate the civil and constitutional organs of the state. They had become ineffective and oppressive through misuse and exploitation, and needed the protection of martial law to recover their original sense of purpose, so as to be able to operate within a constitutional framework. During this phase, the army was positioned in certain key places, whence it could be moved into action. People were a little surprised that the army was not risible during the early days of the revolution. The very word revolution implies a replacement of existing civil authority by military, or at least a special authority. Now this replacement had in fact taken place, but I was anxious not to make a demonstration of it. It was vital that the army be kept in the background, because that was where it belonged in the normal life of the country. Had it too got directly involved in the civil administration, the effect would have been a further demoralization and disintegration of the civil authority. It would have also made the withdrawal of the army from civilian life to their normal sphere of work more difficult. I did not have any doubt that the army would be destroyed if it got too mixed up in running the civil administration, or too involved with the economic, social and political affairs of the country. Among the long-term objectives of the revolution was the introduction of major reforms designed to remove the confusion and imbalance in the social and economic life of the country. These reforms were to culminate in the introduction of a proper constitution and restoration of constitutional life. There was a suggestion made to me at one time that along with the reforms I should introduce an interim constitution, a rough working arrangement, before the final constitution was adopted. Now tins I regarded as dangerous. The martial law represented the working constitution, and before martial law was lifted, the country should have a permanent constitutional framework. I said to myself, when the constitution comes, it must be the final tiling. It did not take me more than 6 months to achieve the immediate and short-term objectives. The basic structure of the civil administration was sound. All that it needed was a sense of confidence and freedom to operate, without having to worry about extraneous considerations. The civil institutions responded to the situation admirably, and started functioning efficiently and independently within a very short time. But there was a feeling in the army that things were not moving fast enough, that civilians were not reacting as quickly as they should, and that people were beginning to feel frustrated. I told them, look, you are used to running a system on which the country spends its last rupee. You are given all possible equipment and weapons, so that when the time comes you do your job 100% well, because on that would depend the survival of the country. With all the facilities, training and equipment, look at the amount of criticism that takes place at the end of every exercise. One has to be patient in these things. Your life is a regulated life. A civilian officer, once he gets the command, will do a good job, but he has to work within the limitations of the law, and in the full gaze of public opinion. A person may have suffered wrongfully, and even if a civilian officer wanted to act immediately to remove the cause of his suffering, he would come up against the law of the land. He must act in full consciousness of the requirements and limitations of the law, and the civil administration is running at 70% of its normal strength. One cannot put too much pressure on it. Also, some people are not above false complaints or wanting more than their due. All this would silence the army officers, but they were not really convinced. What they did not understand was that civil action was subject to the limitations of the law, and had to take into account currents and cross-currents of public opinion. I would tell them of the results of 2 quick actions which were taken by us during the first days of the revolution. We produced 2 martial law regulations. One made the adulteration of foodstuffs a criminal offense, and the other made black marketing subject to heavy punishment. The result was that sweetmeats started selling at Nepalese rupee 1 to 50 a seer, and adulteration of foodstuffs was completely checked. But within a fortnight, all the stocks were exhausted, and business came to a standstill. There was great initial enthusiasm for price controls too, and everybody started buying crockery, cutlery and watches at very reasonable prices. But once the stocks were sold, there was nothing to replace them. The businessmen had no incentive to reinvest. I remember on one occasion we had a meeting of senior army officers, and they submitted to me a paper which explained how everything was going wrong in the country. The Commander-in-Chief, General Musa, was also there at the meeting. I asked him, "Does this paper represent your views too?" He answered, "Yes, all of us feel like that." I said, "You know, this paper was given to me this morning when I was having a cup of tea. I read it and it gave me the feeling that Pakistan must be coming to an end." Then, I took up the morning paper in which some Italian had predicted that tomorrow would be doomsday. I do not know about doomsday, but so far as Pakistan is concerned, it is there and it will stay, and no one will be able to thwart its progress. That was a little hard on them, but I wanted to show the army officers that they should not expect miracles. They were deeply impressed by the initial enthusiasm of the people for the change and were getting disturbed when the enthusiasm began to ebb. People always want immediate results. When Pakistan was established, they thought that they would have no more problems in life. Similarly, when the revolution came, they hoped that everything would change overnight. Now, the revolution was a logical culmination of events in the country. It did not mean the end of all problems, it only meant a fresh opportunity to deal with the problems in an earnest, realistic manner. This opportunity had to be utilized by the people. What was required was hard work, dedication, and patience. And patience is not an easy virtue to acquire. Nor, for that matter, is the habit of working hard cultivated without effort. I was not looking for dramatic results. The enthusiasm of the people could have been easily maintained at a high pitch by adopting sensational and extreme measures. I think there was some expectation that the revolutionary regime would provide dramatic openings and sequences. Had I succumbed to the temptation of pandering to public taste, I should have diverted national energy into negative channels. So I was quite prepared to face a certain amount of dissatisfaction among the people and a measure of pessimism within the army itself. I was determined to go about my work in a moderate and rational manner, not for a moment forgetting the real and long-term objectives of the revolution. This consciousness of public reaction also set a limit on my timetable for the introduction of the reforms. I felt that I must launch my full program within a period of about 2 years, and by then the stage should be set for the introduction of the Constitution. My first anxiety was to introduce land reforms and to settle the refugee problem. Then there were reforms to be brought about in the administration and in the sphere of education. The legal system of the country needed revision, and there was need to regulate the Awqafs, trusts. The whole pattern of social and political life in the country had to be reorganized on democratic principles, so as to ensure the participation of the people in the affairs of the country in a constructive and meaningful way. I knew that the objectives of the revolution could not be achieved through force. Of course, we do need disciplinary arrangements to deal with those who cross the line, but people must have freedom to think and act independently and sensibly. You cannot change social attitudes by stringent measures. Stringency begets resistance, and every now and then you are forced to tighten the screw. The result is an extreme form of oppression and constant application of force, to which there is no limit. Social attitudes can be changed and given a positive direction only through persuasion and education. We were able to set certain standards during the early months of martial law and show how affairs should be run, but people had to learn to do things themselves. I was told at that time that I was dealing with the politicians who had been responsible for the ills of the country, in too moderate a fashion. Merely keeping them out of politics for a certain number of years was not the answer. The moment they got an opportunity, they would hit back. Now I was not dealing with individuals. It would have been possible to liquidate a certain number of people in the customary fashion, but that would not have meant the end of those inherent weaknesses, or the social and political conditions of which individual politicians were only a manifestation. So long as those conditions continued, the place vacated by the politicians would be occupied by others who would behave in the same way. Harsh and violent methods of dealing with individuals only establish harsh and violent precedents, and lead to an unending political vendetta. My target was problems, and not individuals. Whenever terrorism, particularly political terrorism, starts in a country, you can never eradicate it from the bones of the people. It stays there. Once this phenomenon appears, it rubs off the thin veneer of civilization, and provides an outlet for man's most primitive and animal instincts. Political victimization leaves a lasting scar. The revolution could easily have turned into a blind alley, where there would be no going forward and no return. My ambition was not to prove to the world how well I could run the show. My anxiety was to establish conditions and set up institutions to prove how well the country could run itself. The vital tiling was to help people to identify themselves with the objectives of the revolution so that things should move on their own momentum. People must recognize the advantages of the revolution, and acquire a sense of participation in their own affairs. Part 2. Soon after the promulgation of martial law, I defined the relationship between the civil and martial law authorities to prevent misunderstanding and parallel actions which might create confusion and frustration. I made it clear that the running of the civil administration was the responsibility of the provincial governors. It was for them to see that their officers discharged their duties in a sympathetic, efficient, honest and expeditious manner. The basic administrative structure remained the same. I selected a cabinet, and through the martial law regulations and the normal administrative processes of the two provinces, we put our program into action. The primary role of martial law was to give support to the civil authority, so that it should be able to rehabilitate itself and cope with the new problems which would arise with the introduction of reforms. This support should take the form of producing martial law regulations to fill any deficiencies in the normal law, and of providing assistance in carrying out the inspection of administration, and by patrolling trouble spots. Special and summary courts should also be set up where required. As a general rule, cases against martial law, and cases involving anti-state and anti-social activities, should be tried by military courts. There should be frequent meetings between the governors and the martial law administrators to exchange views and seek guidance and assistance. Military officers were told that the best help they could give was to appreciate the conditions under which the civilians had to work, to recognize the limitations of economic and other factors, and respect the attitudes and opinions of the public. The first years of the revolution were, in many ways, the most rewarding years. The regime enjoyed widespread public support throughout the country, and was sustained and inspired by popular enthusiasm. Every measure we took evoked immediate response. I took full advantage of the situation, and introduced my full program of reforms without losing time. We used to meet frequently in the cabinet in those days. I remember our first meeting on Monday, October 27, 1953. It was midday when the meeting started. I gave my colleagues an assessment of the situation prevailing in the country prior to October 7, 1958. I then outlined the problems that we were facing. The first requirement was to bring about stability in the economic life of the country. In the past, economic matters had been dealt with more on the basis of political or parochial considerations than on economic and financial considerations. The second problem was food shortage. We had enough land and manpower to become self-sufficient in food. What was needed was leadership and direction. A Land Reforms Commission had been set up, and we ought to be able to evolve a more equitable system of land tenure. The educational system of the country also required attention. Our aim should be to provide a system designed to meet the needs of the people, and to produce better and more useful citizens. It would be necessary to give it a more practical bias, and set up some mode of selection whereby students might qualify for higher studies. The resettlement of displaced persons, refugees from the time of partition, had been delayed too long. It was essential to solve this problem quickly in the interests of the displaced persons, as well as the economy of the country. I thought that the meal services were overstaffed and underpaid. A complete reorganization of the federal and provincial services was necessary. A Pay and Services Commission and a Reorganization Commission should go into these questions. We should take steps to weed out inefficient government servants. This might require some drastic measures, but we would have to adopt them in the interests of sound administration. I then explained to the cabinet the nature of martial law. It was not an instrument of tyranny or punishment. it was an arrangement under which government had acquired certain unusual powers to implement a program of basic reforms. What the country needed was sound administration, a stable economy, and a reasonable standard of living. The new regime was determined to achieve these objectives. Normal trade and business must be re-established. There was a sense of fear in business circles, and it was important to restore business confidence. I was informed in this meeting that a number of businessmen had surrendered smuggled goods within the time limit of our amnesty. It was decided that those who had acted within the time limit should not be punished, and goods surrendered by them should be returned, after charging customs duty. In certain areas, martial law authorities had asked people to pay their income tax arrears within 15 days. I was told that some people might have to sell their business premises in order to comply with these orders. That I thought would be harsh, and the time limit was extended to 3 months. We examined the question of the repatriation of unauthorized foreign exchange holdings abroad by Pakistani nationals. I wanted a system to be worked out under which we could get these holdings. Screening committees in the various ministries and in the provincial governments were to look into eases of inefficient and corrupt officials. I wanted machinery set up to reward good and efficient civil servants. I advised my cabinet colleagues not to make tall promises to the public in order to win cheap popularity. People should be told that we were facing a difficult period, and that they should not expect miracles. Miracles could happen only if everybody worked hard, and did his utmost in the service of the country. Too much publicity was being given to the arrests made by martial law authorities, and was creating a scare in the country. Our effort should be to restore normal conditions, and not to create an impression that we were going to deal with every little lapse in a harsh manner. We should devise some machinery to review the eases of all persons who had been arrested under the preventive provisions of the law, after the imposition of martial law. Our preoccupations at that time can be shown by extracts from the memoranda I kept of some of the discussions at cabinet meetings. November 1, 1958. I emphasized the need for exercising greater control in financial matters. The investment policy of the Pakistan Industrial Development Corporation was discussed. It was decided that PIDC should not enter into any future commitments for capital expenditure without obtaining prior approval from government. In line with my ideas contained in the 1954 document, I was working on the future pattern of autonomous organizations. The normal working of government departments is severely restrictive, there is too much red tape. The needs of agriculture and industrial development called for the setting up of special institutions with sufficient authority and autonomy to regulate their own working. These autonomous institutions should be assigned specific tasks, and given the resources to accomplish them, and there should be as little interference in their working as possible. That would be the only way to maintain the momentum of development. These institutions should be functioning before the Constitution was introduced. That would ensure that development activities would go on unhindered by politics. November 6, 1958. I mentioned in the cabinet that we should take up the construction of the Quaid-e-Azam's mausoleum. I asked Miss Fatima Jinnah to associate herself with the committee set up for the purpose. The previous governments had been lax in giving people permission to start daily and weekly newspapers. In certain cases permission had been granted to those who did not have adequate funds to run the paper, with the result that they were earning their livelihood by resorting to blackmail. It was important that we build a healthy and responsible press. There was need for civil and military officers to get to know each other. Young civilians, after training in their respective academics, could be profitably attached to the army for a period of 2 to 3 months. This would give them a chance to acquaint themselves with its working, and benefit from army discipline. December 4, 1958. I mentioned in the cabinet that we should clarify our future policy with regard to the problem of Jammu and Kashmir. We should also consider what further steps must be taken to bring about a just and honorable settlement of this dispute. Once it was resolved according to the wishes of the people, we would have peace in this region. People should be prepared for land reforms. There was no reason for unnecessary fear because the reforms would be scientific and realistic, and government would act justly towards all concerned. I mentioned in the meeting that I was working on my broadcast to the nation on the Quaid-e-Azam's birthday, on 25th December. I wanted to use this occasion to remind the people of their responsibilities. We were making a fresh start in life. It should be clear to everyone that the regime had not come to power for personal gain. Its achievements would depend on the amount of hard work which was put in, individually and collectively. As individuals we should undertake an exercise in self-analysis and purification, and collectively we should observe the principle of avoiding all that might harm the interests of the country. We should defend our country, not only in physical terms, but also by combating anti-Pakistan ideas. I would also give the people some idea of the future constitution. The new regime was anxious to introduce a fully representative form of government, based on a democratic system capable of being understood and worked by our people. We must avoid political instability. As soon as the major problems were solved and basic reforms introduced, the best constitutional brains of the country would be asked to frame a constitution. In doing so, the wishes and desires of the people would be fully respected, consistent with the interests of our country. We should immediately prepare a paper spelling out our foreign policy and objectives. Our relations with other countries would be determined by our requirements of national defense and development, and must reflect the geopolitical compulsions of our location. We would hold fast to those who were our friends, but would continue to seek new friends, particularly among our neighbors. December 24, 1958. I asked for an objective study of the future shape of the Baghdad Pact. December 31, 1958. I mentioned in the cabinet that the introduction of Roman script for all the languages of Pakistan would help increase literacy, and could result also in the creation of a common language. I wanted my colleagues to consider this problem dispassionately. There were a number of waqfs, religious endowments. These could be administered by the government, and their income utilized for the welfare of the people. Similarly, income from zakat, money reserved for the poor, could also be centralized under the government. I wanted the commission which had been set up for sitting the federal capital to complete its work quickly. The capital must be moved out of Karachi. The place was humid and unhealthy. Also, it was dominated by business which had a corrupting influence on the services. January 10, 1959. There were persistent complaints of neglect from certain areas. The reason was that provincial administration had not been separated from local administration. We must have further decentralization of authority and administrative powers. Administrative and political reforms must be woven into the future pattern of our constitution. We should start giving thought to the matter. We must first decide whether the country could be best governed under a parliamentary system or a presidential system. What kind of legislature should the country have, and what should be its size? While the principle of universal adult franchise was accepted, we should evolve a system in which people would be able to exercise their right of vote with understanding and judgment. And so the days rolled by. The civil organs of the administration were revived. The army went back to barracks. One by one the reforms were launched and we came to grips with the basic political problems of the country.